Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of writing a debate. Now that you know how to write a debate through and through and all its glory, let us now check out a debate in action. The topic for this debate is: this house believes that the West has no right to impose environmental standards on developing countries. We'll first proceed with for the motion or the proposition.
Environmental standards are primarily designed to counter climate change. Yes, they're also concerned with the protection of endangered species and areas of natural beauty. But I shall focus on climate change because without addressing this, the other reasons will cease to matter. Recently, the frequency of climate-related disasters has increased dramatically. We are faced now with 600,000 deaths a year due to these disasters. 95% of those who have lost their lives and will lose their lives are citizens of what are commonly known as developing countries. Climate change will affect everyone on this earth, but it will be, and currently is, those living less stable lives than most of us in the West who will feel its ramifications most keenly. Those who live lives dependent on the revenue from tourism, those economies are heavily dependent on areas of natural beauty, and those whose homes and cities are often built on low land. In short, those people living in developing countries. No one in Bangladesh needs a lecture on the threat posed by climate change. With 80% of their country situated on a floodplain, they are more than aware of the precarious environmental situation. At the end of 2014, China had the highest installed wind energy capacity. Second place went to America, with just over half as much. China also has the second greatest installed solar capacity and has expressed its commitment to phasing out coal usage and dealing with polluted air. They are more than aware. However, for these countries, such as India, faced with issues such as high infant mortality, which stands at 30 in 1,000 infants, compared to EU levels of 5.7 in 1,000 infants, environmental issues might not always take priority. Yet, despite this, India was ranked 22nd best in the world on the basis of emissions and use of renewable energy in the Climate Change Performance Index 2016. Where do we find America on this list? America, with its dominant position in the West, its supposedly better developed infrastructure, and its assertions of having the right to dictate standards. America came 31st. We need less imposed, financially unrealistic legislation and more financial incentives from the West to develop sustainably. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be able to speak to you before you this evening. Furthermore, it's an honor to speak against such a competent opposition. Speaking first for the opposition is a friend of mine and fellow member of the Secretaries Committee, Ms. Kriti Joshi. Kriti, whilst conducting Intel on you, a close friend of yours requested that I publicly beg that you please end your beatboxing career this evening, as apparently you think you're really good, but it's just tragic. I'm very sorry. However, she is also the only person I know who can persuade Starbucks not to worry because she'll come back and pay later. I hope it's her persuasive skills we'll be seeing this evening. Secondly, we'll be hearing from Mr. Paul Bledsoe, former figure in President Clinton's Climate Change Task Force and current president of Bledsoe & Associates, a climate change public policy firm. I will admit that to get ahead of the game, I had a quick browse through your Twitter account. Although this was unsuccessful for the debate, I do feel far more informed about your views on Minions and Leonardo DiCaprio. So I thank you for that. Last but not least, we have Professor Bruce Pardee, esteemed author of Ecologic. He's also a lecturer at Queen's University in Canada, and before this, I stumbled upon one student review calling him distractingly hot. I just want to reassure you that I think I'll be able to keep my focus on the debate this evening. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. Imagine a game involving 3 cups. Under one cup is a ball. 2 people each get to pick a cup, and both will win if either finds the ball. Unfortunately, the first player goes and doesn't find it. The cup is replaced, and the second player now has their turn. It's in the interest of the first person to tell the second as much as they can. In this case, the cup the ball was not under. However, the choice between the 2 remaining cups should be left entirely to the second player. The situation I have just described in this analogy represents the most justified role for the West as we go forward with the climate change unknown. They have lots to share, starting from the mistakes they've made, symbolized by the cup they chose. Furthermore, the West also has lots to offer from the vast, costly research it has conducted. The whole world is united in the same direction with respect to climate change, and no one authority has got the complete key yet. The final choices on climate change should be left to the individual countries. Just as in the game, the second player should be able to decide which cup he finally chooses. We all want to go in the same direction, but some cultural things may mean that we want to take different directions, and other such factors. So, let's examine why one body would view itself as being justified in having a right to impose something on another. Particularly when, as in this case, those 2 bodies are groups of countries at different levels of development. Problematic due to the dangerous assumption that a developed body would be better placed to solve a problem. One body imposing something on another thus implies that the former has a superior opinion or position from which to exert its right. To oppose this motion is to claim that the West does have such a position of dominance over the developing world. Any assertion that the West has a right to impose environmental standards must necessarily rest on the premise that they have this right because they are in some way justified in exercising control over developing countries. And, as I shall go on to explain, they are in no way justified in exercising such a right. Because, quite simply, this right is unfounded. Sorry, my argument is accumulating. I'd rather wait to the end to hear that if I have time. Thank you for your troubles. There are 2 bodies under examination here. On one side, we have the West, and on the other, the developing countries. I do not use these labels without acknowledging the potential ramifications of generalizing that this could bring upon. But it remains useful for assessing the balance of power and influence between the 2. In order to assert that one group has the right to impose environmental standards on the other, the opposition must prove to all of us that the West has some superior position, some greater understanding of climate change, some justified authority. However, as I shall prove, this is in fact fantasy. The West was originally a theoretical conglomerate based upon the nations of Western Europe and America. Today, it is seen as a group of developed countries, described primarily by their GDPs per capita, and sharing broadly similar political systems. If we take the example of America, significant as the most populated and largest of Western countries, then it becomes really rather difficult to justify this supposed environmental superiority on the West's part. Many official statistics on examples of environmental harm, such as CO2 emissions, do not take into account varying population sizes. America produces the 12th largest amount of CO2 per person in the world, according to the UN Statistics Division. If we examine this list, nowhere above America do we find any of the large developing countries. People are often so quick to blame for climate change. Indeed, India can be found at 133rd and China at 55th. CO2 emission statistics alone do not prove overall that the West is more harmful to the environment than these developing countries. Again, sorry I'm building, but if I have time, I will see you at the end. So I've just lost my place now. What they do, is go more than far enough in dispelling the myth that the West can claim some level of superiority to be able to impose environmental standards on developing countries, as though they are some paternal hand dispensing wisdom and rules to lesser bodies. Indeed, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, developing countries are very much aware of the potential ramifications of climate change. I'm not seeking to solve the issue of China's large emissions. I just need to justify to you that it is not right for the West to dictate the required standards to do so. Again, same reasons. Thank you. Climate change and harm to the environment does and will continue to affect us all. That is why, with this motion, we are not suggesting that the West completely ignore developing countries. We, as a global community, should very much be working together to conduct research and introduce measures. The issue here is with the West asserting that it has a right to impose such measures on developing countries. I have proven that such a right is entirely unfounded. Instead, the West, as a body which is generally more able to devote more research to environmental matters due to greater development in many areas, such as healthcare, has a duty to share these resources and research with developing countries. A duty. A matter then not of right, but of an obligation for humanity. I've proven why the West has no right to impose such standards. But you may ask, what about the continuing problem of climate change and developing countries' role in contributing to it? In response to this, I return to my earlier analysis of just how skewed many people's perception of what their proportional environmental harm actually is. Moreover, I would like to highlight the numerous examples of these countries being involved in international forums such as the UN's 2015 Climate Change Conference, commonly known as COP21. These countries were heavily overrepresented at this conference. Google the terms developing countries and the environment, and you'll find numerous horror stories of pollution and harm. Look a little bit further, and you'll find the examples I have given you of cooperation, of awareness, of sustainable energy and growth. The stigma towards the developing world is based around a fear of the future. If unchecked, where will we be in 20, 30 years from now? If we all continue the work begun over the last few years primarily, I believe we will stop climate change. No Western superior moral platform from which to impose environmental standards can be found. And as I've shown, none is needed. Thus, the West has no right at all to impose environmental standards on developing countries. Now, as a final thought, I'd like to leave you something else. Well, if we give the West the right to do this, we then run the risk of certain things such as the abuse of this power. Take, for example, nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a force for good. Look at France. They use nuclear energy vastly to deal with less CO2 emissions. But America and the West are scared of this technology falling into the wrong hands, rightly, because the ability to develop nuclear weapons. Would that then cause the West, maybe, to form legislations that maybe stop people developing technology such as this for a fear of something else? And can we allow that? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Now that we have heard for the motion, we'll now hear against the motion or the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. One of the most iconic quotes of English literature, and also from one of my favorite novels. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share with you briefly not a tale of two cities, but a tale of two planets. Earth and Venus are essentially the same size, essentially the same distance from the sun, and both have exactly the same amount of carbon. The difference is that over time on Earth, the carbon has been trapped in the ground in the form of coal, oil, natural gas, whereas on Venus, most of the carbon is in the atmosphere. The difference is that on Earth, the average temperature is around 50 degrees, whereas on Venus, it is around 850 degrees. Not just because it's slightly closer to the sun, Mercury is the closest to the Sun and is around 3 times cooler than Venus. This is vaguely relevant to our current strategy of, especially developing nations, of taking as much ground-based carbon and ejecting it into the atmosphere. Ladies and gentlemen, we must responsibly consider what we will be debating over tonight. The climate crisis is something where the consequences are not local, they are global. It affects all of us, and particularly, as I hope to show you in the next few minutes, the developing nations themselves. When Shashi Tharoor came to address the Union, he stated that the industrialization of the West was based on the deindustrialization of countries like India, and I agree. But we have to see what's at stake here. The climate crisis is causing reduced growing seasons, changing range of disease, droughts, species extinctions, severe storms. If anything, as Jack said, the West owe it to developing nations, such as India, to work together, share technologies and strategies that can help them not mirror the same mistakes the British made in the Industrial Revolution of the 20th century. But before I take us further into this nightmare on St. Michael's Street, it falls upon me to introduce the members of the opposition. I tried. We have just had the pleasure of hearing Jack Woolett's fine speech. Jack, who studies engineering at Pembroke College, is one of the most genuine and kind people that I know, and became a very close friend of mine during the 2 whole days he spent at the Union over the VAC. So, I struggled to find anything particularly juicy from his friends to bring up tonight. Jack, your speech was great, but I will have to explain to my family in India, who will listen to this debate on Audible, that the lower voice on the recording is actually mine. Next in proposition, we have Peter Lilly, who is a British Conservative Party politician who has been a Member of Parliament since 1983. He has served as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry under Margaret Thatcher and currently serves on the Environmental Audit Select Committee and is extremely qualified to speak on this debate. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this very current topic. And finally, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Paul Oquist, who has served as a minister of the government of Nicaragua and Secretary of Public Policy. He has been all over the world, working in Colombia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and is a leading expert on climate change. Therefore, I'm very excited to hear you speak later on this evening. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. So I guess the first question is, do the developing countries need to change? Jack claimed that India ranked 22nd with respect to emissions. Well, the last time I was in India, which was in January, I was sitting with my cousin on our veranda, and she was painting the garden.
Point of information.
All right, go ahead, Jack.
The ranking wasn't emissions. The ranking is for progress towards changing.
All right,
towards
fine.
the climate. Yeah.
I accept that. Misquote of your statistic, but it still applies to my case. She's 3 years old, my cousin. So she did like the classic thing of with her painting, she left out the sky, and I, as a proud art A-level student, said to her, you know, why don't you just fill this whole place, this white space here with color? And she literally turns to me, and she's like, Kriti, I don't have enough brown. And I'm like, okay, the Indian sky is not blue, it's gray. It's opaque. You can literally go outside and feel the pollution filling your lungs. We think of the sky as a vast, limitless expanse, but the reality is it's just a thin shell which continues to crack under the blunt hammer of our daily emissions. The accumulated amount of man-made global warming pollution that is up in the atmosphere, in that thin shell, is trapping the energy equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours, 365 days a year. Just picture that. That is a lot of heat. And it's mostly in our oceans, resulting in newer, more catastrophic storms than we have ever seen before. The effect is everywhere. Houston, last July, it rained for 2 days, 162 billion gallons of water. That's someone picking up the Niagara Falls and allowing it to flow for 2 days on top of a very populated city. Of course, there are devastating results. For example, George Foreman's delayed visit to the Union. I mean, pretty devastating. Now, 14 of the 16 years that have comprised the 21st century have broken temperature records. The global warming is resulting in microbial diseases from countries around the equator to spread to Western countries in higher latitudes that previously sustained temperatures that were cool enough to be hostile to these diseases. While places like North America and Britain have better public health systems, women in some regions of South America are advised not to get pregnant for 2 years. That is a red flag for something that we need to realize is a serious problem that requires a global effort towards fixing. I'll stop talking about how terrifying the situation really is, because I presume that I've scared you all enough thus far. And if you're not scared, then you don't really understand where we are as a species. The fact of the matter is, from an economic perspective, the cost of the climate crisis is building up. Central bankers, like Governor Mark Carney, says that the vast majority of the carbon reserves are unburnable. This is a great risk to global economy. And if developing nations are not held to strict environmental standards now, they will develop their infrastructure around unsustainable practices. Thus, to prevent the locking in of outdated environmental actions, equal environmental standards must be enforced internationally. The proposition will take offense at the word impose. There is an alternative of working together with these developing nations to provide a more sustainable set of environmental standards. However, in the history of global warming crisis, humans have been incredibly short-sighted. Leaders of industrializing countries will place their country's immediate priorities before the vague, undefined future of climate change in this world. This means that the cheapest, fastest method of industrialization will be more preferable to one that is possibly slower, but in the long term more safe for the environment as a whole. We cannot afford to look locally anymore. We have to look at the big picture. In a report by the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development, it is argued that the potential economic and social impacts of environmental degradation are particularly serious for developing countries, given their dependence on natural resources for economic growth and their vulnerability to energy, food, water security, climate change, and extreme weather risks. Populations in developing nations are more reliant upon, connected to, and impacted by the environment than populations in the developed world. The most at-risk populations for negative impacts from environmental degradation are the rural, poor, and developing nations. Proponents of equal environmental standards for developing nations argue that it is in the best interest of developing nations to put in place strict environmental policies in order to best protect their populations. So I can say with a definitive stance that environmental standards indeed should be imposed. But I am in no way suggesting that the West have a right to impose these standards on developing nations and just leave them to manage it alone. The fact of the matter is that most of these nations lack the infrastructure and expertise to implement the standards that are likely to be set. Many developing countries also have established some form of governmental structure that seeks to address their environmental problems. However, there are inherent barriers within these governments, such as corruption, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and lack of political willingness that are preventing visible differences from being seen, which is a classic case study would be my home country, India. And all the while, our world is dying. Of course, it is Western nations that have capitalized on industrial technology that have incurred these problems. They did it first. So it may well be thought of hypocritical of Western nations to demand developing nations who are struggling to improve their economies to maintain those standards that will probably hinder their economic progress. But we need to tackle this problem. If anything, the environmental standards placed on developing countries should serve as the global baseline, setting a precedent for more industrialized countries to take the lead in the path to a sustainable future. It makes no sense to say the West have industrialized irresponsibly and therefore the developing nations are allowed to just go ahead and do so as well. These nations have negatively contributed to the environment through high populations, draining resources, and heavy pollution causing havoc all over the planet. Climate change is a global problem, and hence it is a global duty. Developing nations have the least incentive to commit to this, which is why the West must come in and aid in any way that they can to ensure that there is a safe environmental standards that are everywhere. There is no denying climate change is a serious threat. If we continue at the rate that we're going at, Bangladesh, the most crowded nation on earth, is set to submerge under the oceans by the end of this century. All of us sitting here in this chamber today will probably still be alive to witness the fate of 150 million people as the sea reclaims the land on which they depend. It doesn't matter how developed or undeveloped this country is, there is no country. We must oppose this motion. The real debate here is not whether or not there should be environmental standards, but how they are implemented and imposed.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much.